Picture this. Seville, 859 AD. The smell hits you first, a thick metallic stench of copper and rot that overpowers the heat. Look up at the date palms lining the riverbank. Those aren't fruits hanging from the branches, they are heads, 400 of them. The skin is peeling, the eyes are pecked out by birds, but the long blonde hair remains. These are the severed heads of the Northmen. Down at the harbour, the scene gets worse. Dockworkers are sealing crates, but they aren't packing silk. They are salting 200 more Viking heads, prepping them for shipment to Africa as a diplomatic gift. This isn't a battlefield, it's a butcher shop, and it is the grim receipt for the ambition of Björn Ironside. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how the ocean's apex predators ended up as decorations on trees, we need to cut back to the icy fjords of Kattegat. Björn Ironside was suffocating. Being the son of Ragnar Lothbrok was a curse. His father's legend was a heavy chain, dragging behind Björn with every step. He had raided Francia, he had burned villages, but it wasn't enough. The whispers in the Great Hall were getting louder. Is he just a shadow of his father? Björn didn't just want wealth, he demanded immortality. He needed a conquest so impossible that it would silence the ghosts of his ancestors. Hastein provided the map. A veteran warlord with a heart as cold as the Baltic, Hastein knew that raiding England was child's play. He wanted the ultimate prize. He pointed a scarred finger south, past the known world, toward the centre of the Christian universe, Rome. The plan was simple and suicidal. They would sail farther than any Viking fleet in history, bypassing the muddy coasts of the north to strike at the heart of the empire itself. They assembled an armada of 62 longships. This was a floating city of 3,000 warriors, the deadliest men Scandinavia had to offer. They reinforced their hulls for the open ocean and sharpened their axes. The Viking Mediterranean Raid was a go. The mood on the docks was electric. They believed they were sailing to plunder a soft, fat empire. They were wrong. As the prows cut through the waves, leaving the safety of the north behind, they weren't hunting. They were migrating into a kill zone. They were sailing straight toward the Emirate of Córdoba, a civilization that treated warfare as a science, and they had no idea that their wooden shields were about to meet the fire of the south. The Atlantic Ocean is a cruel mistress, but the 62 dragon ships of Björn Ironside tamed her. They rounded the rugged cliffs of Finisterre, the end of the world to the Romans, and sighted the lush green coast of Galicia. To the Viking crews, this looked like business as usual. They saw church spires rising above the tree line. They saw smoke drifting from wealthy settlements. In their minds, the script was already written. Beach the ships, storm the village, slaughter the militia, and carry the gold back to the decks before the sun touched the horizon. They had done it 100 times in Francia and England. They assumed Spain would bleed just as easily. They were wrong. The Kingdom of Asturias was not a fragmented collection of terrified monks. It was a fortress state forged in the fires of the Reconquista. For over a century, these Christian warriors had been fighting a brutal existential war against the Islamic caliphates to the south. They lived in a permanent state of mobilization. Their bells did not just call the faithful to prayer, they signalled the muster of the heavy cavalry. When Björn's lookout spotted the golden crosses of Santiago de Compostela, they thought they had found a treasure chest. In reality, they had stumbled into a hornet's nest. The landing was chaotic. The Vikings surged onto the beaches, their axes raised, screaming the war cries that had frozen the blood of Parisians and Londoners. But the beaches of Galicia did not empty in panic. The locals did not run. Instead, the Vikings were met by a disciplined wall of steel. The Asturian forces, led by Count Pedro, were waiting. This was the moment the Northmen realised their technology was lagging. A Viking round shield, made of linden wood and reinforced with iron strips, is an ingenious tool for deflecting a sword swing or a light arrow. It is lightweight and agile, but it was never designed to stop a heavy crossbow bolt fired at close range. the air filled with the sharp snap of bowstrings, followed by the sickening crunch of wood splintering. Men who had survived a dozen raids in England dropped dead before they could even swing their weapons, their chests pierced by quarrels that punched through shield, leather and bone. Björn rallied his huskarls, the elite bodyguards, and tried to break the Asturian line with a wedge formation. They charged with the ferocity of cornered bears. Axe met chainmail, sparks flew. But the Asturian armour held. These defenders were equipped to fight the Moors, whose metallurgy was light years ahead of the north. Against the crude iron of the Vikings, the Spanish steel was impenetrable. The Vikings hammered away, exhausting themselves, while the Asturians held their ground with the stoic discipline of Roman legionaries. Then came the cavalry. The thunder of hooves drowned out the screams of the dying. The Vikings were infantrymen. They fought on foot, shoulder to shoulder. They had no counter for heavy horsemen charging down the beach. The Asturian knights crashed into the Viking flank, shattering the shield wall like glass. It was a massacre. The hunters became the hunted, pushed back into the surf, the salt water turning pink around their boots. Hastein, watching from the command ship, recognized the futility instantly. This was not a fight they could win with rage alone. He signalled the retreat. The great horns blew the mournful notes of withdrawal. The survivors scrambled back onto the longships, pushing off frantically as arrows thudded into the hulls and masts. They left hundreds of their brothers dead on the sand, their bodies stripped of weapons and left for the gulls. As the fleet limped back out to sea, the mood on the decks was grim. The aura of invincibility was gone. Björn sat at the prow, staring at the receding coastline. He had promised his men glory. He had given them a slaughter. The damage was psychological as much as physical. They had been repelled not by numbers, but by superior warfare. The realization was bitter. The further south they went, the harder the world became. But they could not turn back. Returning to Kattegat now with empty holds and fewer men would be political suicide. Björn would be laughed out of the Great Hall. They were trapped by their own ambition. Hastein convened a war council on the lead ship. The map lay spread out on a barrel, flapping in the wind. North was shame. East was the impregnable coast of Asturias. There was only one way left, south. Hastein pointed a dagger down the coastline toward the lands held by the Emirate of Córdoba. He argued that the Christians were ready for them, but perhaps the Muslims further south would be surprised. It was a gamble based on desperation. They reasoned that no one would expect a Viking fleet to sail into the heart of the Islamic world. They repaired their ships at sea, patching the arrow holes with tar and wool. They sharpened their axes, honing the edges until they could shave the hair off an arm. The defeat had stripped away their arrogance, replacing it with a cold, survivalist focus. They were no longer tourists in a war zone. They were desperate men with nothing to lose. The fleet drifted south, passing the mouth of the Tagus River, eyeing the fortifications of Lisbon. They tested the defences, probing for a weakness, but the Moors were just as vigilant as the Christians. The watchtowers lit signal fires that cascaded down the coast, warning of the Magus, the fire worshippers, approaching from the sea. Finally, they found an opening near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. The city of Seville, Isbilia, lay upstream. It was a jewel of the Islamic West, unguarded by the heavy fortifications that protected the coast. The Vikings rode hard against the current, their hunger for gold renewed by the promise of an unlooted city. They did not know that they were sailing into a trap that would make the beaches of Galicia look like a playground skirmish. They were about to commit the greatest mistake of the entire expedition. They were about to insult the Emir. The Guadalquivir River is a sluggish brown vein that feeds the heart of Andalusia. For the Viking fleet, it was a highway paved with opportunity. Unlike the jagged coast of Galicia, the riverbanks here were soft, lined with olive groves and vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Northmen rowed in silence, the only sound the rhythmic splash of oars and the creak of timber. They were deep inland now, miles from the safety of the open sea. It was a violation of every survival instinct they possessed, but the scent of wealth was overpowering. When the walls of Isbilia, Seville, finally broke through the heat haze, the Vikings lowered their oars in genuine astonishment. They were used to the wooden fortresses of the Slavs, or the damp stone keeps of the Saxons. Seville was different. It was a metropolis of white plaster and geometric tiles, a city that shimmered like a pearl in the dust. At night it was said to be lit by so many oil lamps that a man could read a scroll in the street. To the dirty, salt-crusted warriors of the north it looked like Asgard. And it was undefended. The local governor had been complacent. He believed the river was protection enough that no pirate would dare venture this far inland. He was fatally wrong. On a blistering October morning, the Viking longships ground onto the mudflats. The rampaging horde that poured out was not an army, it was a natural disaster. The sack of Seville was not a battle, it was a collision of eras. The Vikings, clad in fur and iron, smelling of unwashed bodies and sour ale, smashed into a society obsessed with cleanliness, poetry and algebra. They kicked down doors of intricate cedar wood to steal silver plates. They slaughtered scholars in courtyards filled with fountains. The violence was indiscriminate. Men were cut down where they stood. Women and children were dragged toward the ships to be sold as slaves. Björn Ironside rode through the chaos like a wolf in a sheep pen. He directed his men toward the city's centre, ignoring the screaming civilians, his eyes scanning for the larger structures. They found the great mosque. To the Muslims, this was the sanctuary of God, a place of peace. To the Vikings, it was just a large warehouse storing potential gold. They smashed their way inside. The silence of the prayer hall was shattered by the clatter of heavy boots and the hacking of axes into locked chests. They stripped the gold leaf from the walls, they tore down the lamps, they turned a house of worship into a slaughterhouse. But amidst the looting, a strange unease began to settle over the Viking leadership. Hastein picked up a book from a dead scholar's table. He couldn't read the Arabic script, but he felt the quality of the paper, saw the precision of the ink. He looked at the aqueducts, the irrigation systems, the complex architecture. This wasn't a primitive tribe they were raiding. This was a superpower. They were burning the fingernail of a giant, and the giant was waking up. News of the massacre reached the Emir Abd al-Rahman Zakui in his capital of Córdoba. He did not panic. He did not weep. He was the ruler of the most sophisticated state in Europe. He simply turned to his generals and issued a single cold command: cut off the river. The Emir mobilized the army of the south. These were not feudal levies. They were professional soldiers, cavalrymen riding swift Arabian horses, and archers who trained daily. He also dispatched a fleet from the Atlantic coast to block the river mouth. The trap was mechanical in its precision. Back in Seville, the Vikings were drunk on victory. They had encamped on an island in the river, surrounded by piles of looted silk and weeping captives. They believed the locals were broken. They spent their days gambling and their nights celebrating, oblivious to the dust clouds gathering on the horizon. Björn Ironside, usually so sharp, was blinded by the glint of Spanish gold. He stayed too long. 3 weeks after the fall of Seville, the first scout rode back to the Viking camp, his horse foaming at the mouth. He didn't bring news of more loot, he brought a warning. The hills around Seville were no longer empty, they were shimmering with the steel of 10,000 spears. The Emirate of Córdoba had arrived and they had not come to negotiate. The party was over. Dawn broke over the Guadalquivir, but the sun was choked out by black smoke. The Vikings, hungover and sluggish from weeks of celebration, woke not to the crow of roosters, but to the rhythmic thumping of drums. It was a sound they had never heard in the north, a disciplined, synchronized beat that signaled the march of a professional army. Björn Ironside rushed from his tent, his eyes adjusting to the light, and saw the nightmare unfolding on the plain of Taliata. The horizon was a solid line of steel. The Emir's forces had not just come to fight, they had come to exterminate. Unlike the chaotic tribal levies of Ireland or the slow-moving infantries of Francia, this army manoeuvred like a single organism. The cavalry wings fanned out to encircle the Viking camp, while the centre held steady, bristling with pikes. But what froze the blood in Björn's veins were the machines. For the first time in their history, the Vikings faced artillery. The Moors dragged mangonels, traction trebuchets into range. These siege engines, usually reserved for breaking city walls, were turned against the wooden stockade of the Viking camp. The air whistled. Earthen jars filled with naphtha smashed into the Viking defences, exploding into liquid fire that water could not extinguish. Men screamed as the flames clung to their skin, their leather armour acting as a wick. The panic was instantaneous. The Northmen were used to the cold bite of steel, not the heat of chemical warfare. Björn tried to form a shield wall, the legendary formation that had broken kings in the north. But a shield wall requires discipline, and his men were terrified. As they locked shields, the Andalusian archers unleashed volleys that darkened the sky. These weren't random shots. They were coordinated waves pinning the Vikings down while the heavy cavalry charged. The impact was catastrophic. The Moorish knights, riding high in their stirrups, crashed into the Viking lines with lances levelled. The shield wall shattered. The battle dissolved into a rout. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was a harvest. The Vikings, usually the ones doing the chasing, found themselves outrun by the swift Arabian horses. Those who turned to fight were cut down with surgical precision. Those who ran were lassoed or ridden down. Hastein dragged Björn toward the riverbank. The ships were their only hope. The retreat was a scene of utter humiliation. The Vikings had to abandon their looted gold, dropping sacks of silver chalices into the mud to run faster. They pushed the longships off the sandbars, scrambling over the gunwales, kicking away their own brothers who were reaching out from the water. This was the moment of the great culling. 400 Vikings were cut off from the ships. They weren't killed immediately. They were surrounded, disarmed, and bound. These were the men whose heads would soon decorate the palm trees of Seville. Björn watched from the deck of his ship as the cavalry rounded up his warriors like cattle. He saw the gleam of scimitars raising and falling in the distance, the beginning of the execution that would send a message to the world. The Vikings are mortal. The fleet limped downriver, but the river mouth was blocked by the Emir's navy. They were trapped. In a stroke of desperate genius, or perhaps sheer luck, Björn and Hastein managed to slip a portion of their fleet through a narrow, unguarded channel during the night, sacrificing even more ships as decoys to the Moorish patrols. When they finally hit the open waters of the Atlantic, the crew was silent. They had lost hundreds of men, they had lost the loot, and they had lost their dignity. But Hastein, ever the strategist, looked at the survivors and saw opportunity. They couldn't go home. Scandinavia would mock them. They couldn't stay in Spain. The Emir would kill them. "We go east," Hastein rasped, pointing toward the Pillars of Hercules, the narrow strait that separated Europe from Africa. "We go where no Northman has ever gone, into the Middle Sea." It was a decision born of fear, not bravery. They were running away, but to the rest of the world it would look like an invasion. The battered remnants of the fleet turned their prows toward the Mediterranean, sailing blindly into a world of blue men, marble cities, and ancient empires. The Viking Mediterranean Raid had officially begun, not as a triumph, but as a desperate flight for survival. The Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, marked the end of the known world for the ancients. For Björn Ironside, passing between those towering rocks was like stepping off the edge of a map. The Atlantic swell vanished, replaced by the calm, turquoise waters of the Mediterranean. To a sailor, this sea looked gentle. It was a lie. The Mediterranean is a cage, a closed ecosystem where storms hit without warning and where every coastline was held by a hostile power. Drifting along the North African coast, the fleet was a shadow of its former glory. The ships were scarred, the sails patched, and the men were on edge. They needed a win. They needed easy prey to wash away the shame of Spain. They found it in the kingdom of Nekor, in modern-day Morocco. This was a world entirely alien to the Northmen. In Scandinavia, the enemy was ice and darkness. Here, the enemy was the sun. It beat down on their iron helmets, boiling their brains, turning their chainmail into ovens. When they beached their ships on the African sand, they didn't encounter knights in steel or phalanxes of pikemen. They met the fur gorm. In the Viking sagas, these people are described as the Blue Men. For centuries, historians thought this was a reference to dark skin, a crude racial descriptor. But the truth is likely more fascinating. The Berber and Tuareg nomads of the region wore robes dyed with indigo. In the heat and sweat of the desert, the dye would bleed, staining their skin a deep, indelible blue. To the superstitious Vikings emerging from the sea mist, these warriors didn't look human. They looked like supernatural entities, spirits of the desert. But spirits don't bleed, and the sack of Nekor proved that the Blue Men were very mortal. The raid was brutal and swift. The Vikings, venting the frustration of their defeats in Spain, tore through the city. They weren't looking for land to settle, they were looking for commodities, and in the 9th century the most valuable commodity was people. They rounded up dozens of these blue men, dragging them in chains back to the Longships. This wasn't just slavery, it was collecting. Björn knew that back in the slave markets of Dublin and Hedeby, these exotic captives would fetch a fortune. They were living proof that he had sailed to the ends of the earth, but as they pushed off from the African coast, the reality of their situation set in. They were rich in slaves, but they were homeless. They couldn't return past Gibraltar. The Moorish fleet was guarding the exit. They were trapped in the Mediterranean. Winter descended. The Mediterranean winter is not the deep freeze of the north, but it is wet, miserable and bone-chilling. The fleet sought refuge in the Camargue, the marshy delta of the Rhone River in southern France. It was a desolate landscape of salt flats and reeds. Here, the apex predators of the ocean were reduced to scavengers. The local Franks were too strong to attack directly, so the Vikings were forced to camp on river islands, shivering in the biting mistral winds that screamed down from the Alps. Food ran low. The sailors hinted at a desperation that borders on madness. They raided small farmhouses, stealing not gold but grain and livestock. They spent their nights huddled under overturned longships, listening to the wind and the groans of the blue men shivering in their chains. Hastein looked at the map in his mind. They couldn't stay here. They were slowly dying of attrition. To survive, they needed a target that would justify all this suffering. They needed a city so rich that one raid would feed them for a lifetime. He turned his eyes east again, toward the boot of Italy. The dream of Rome wasn't dead. It was the only thing keeping them alive. They would sail to Italy, not as conquerors, but as starving wolves desperate for one last great kill. Spring thawed the frozen rigging of the fleet, and the Vikings pushed east, rounding the curve of the Ligurian Sea. They were no longer the disorganized rabble that had shivered in the French marshes. Hunger had sharpened them. They were hunting for the ultimate prize, the city that Hastein had promised would make them kings of kings. Then they saw it, rising from the coastal plain near the mouth of the Magra River. A city of blinding whiteness stood against the green hills. Its walls were not made of grey granite or rough limestone. They were constructed from the pristine marble of the nearby Carrara quarries, the same stone used to build the Pantheon. To the Vikings, whose architectural peak was the wooden longhouse, this was something out of a dream. The sun hit the battlements and flared, a beacon of immense wealth and power. Hastein stood on the prow of the lead ship. He looked at the towering basilicas, the amphitheatre, the sheer scale of the fortifications. He turned to Björn and spoke the word that would seal their fate. Rome. It was a catastrophic error. This was not Rome. This was Luna, an ancient Roman colony that had seen better days but still retained the shell of imperial majesty. But geography in the 9th century was a game of whispers and guesswork. The Vikings had no maps, no compasses, and no concept of how far South Rome actually lay. They saw a city of white stone, and their confirmation bias filled in the rest. They attacked immediately. The Vikings dragged their ships onto the beach and surged toward the gates, expecting the sight of their dragon banners to terrify the defenders into submission. But the Italians were not terrified. They were secure behind 50 feet of solid Roman engineering. The assault was pathetic. The Vikings raised their ladders, but the walls were too high. They battered the gates with rams made of ship masts, but the iron-bound wood held fast. From the battlements, the defenders of Luna rained down rocks and crossbow bolts with leisurely precision. There was no need for panic inside the city. The barbarians outside were like ants gnawing at a diamond. For Björn Ironside, this was a new kind of hell. In the open field, he was a god of war. Here, staring up at smooth, unclimbable marble, he was impotent. The sack of Luna was supposed to be his crowning achievement, but days turned into weeks, and the city remained sealed. The Vikings ravaged the surrounding countryside, burning farms and stealing cattle, but the prize itself remained tantalizingly out of reach. Morale plummeted. The men were grumbling. They had sailed through storms, fought the Moors, and crossed the known world, only to be stopped by a wall. Hastein realised that brute force had failed. The Viking axe could split a skull, but it could not split a city. If they wanted to enter Rome, they would have to stop thinking like warriors and start thinking like thieves. Hastein called off the attacks. He ordered the men to lay down their weapons and retreat to the camp. He sent a messenger to the city gates, not with a threat, but with a white flag. The plan he concocted was so audacious, so steeped in sacrilege, that it has become the defining legend of the expedition. He would not break into the city. He would ask to be carried in, high within the marble sanctuary of the Cathedral of Luna. Bishop Bernardi felt the heavy weight of fear finally lift from his shoulders. For weeks the heathen wolves had howled at his gates. He had seen the smoke of burning vineyards rising from the countryside, a grim signal of the pagan wrath. But now silence had fallen over the plains. The attacks had ceased. Earlier that morning a Viking messenger had approached the city gates. He did not carry an axe, but a branch of peace. He brought news that the great Northman chieftain, Björn Ironside, was dead. The fever of the marshlands had claimed what the arrows of Luna could not. But the messenger brought a strange request. In his final delirium, the chieftain had supposedly renounced his pagan gods. He had seen a vision of the White Christ and begged to be buried in consecrated ground, so that his soul might be saved from the fires of his own hell. To the bishop, this was not a trick. It was a miracle. It was divine proof that the light of the church could pierce even the thickest barbarian skull. He ordered the heavy city gates, which had withstood battering rams and fire, to be thrown open. He prepared the cathedral for a high funeral mass. He imagined the letter he would write to the Pope, detailing how he had spiritually conquered the scourge of the north. The procession began at noon. A column of Viking warriors walked slowly through the marble streets of Luna. They wore long cloaks, their heads bowed in apparent grief. In the centre, 6 burly men carried a massive coffin made of rough-hewn oak. It was heavy, groaning under the weight of the legendary warlord inside. The citizens of Luna lined the streets, watching in silent awe. They saw tears on the faces of the barbarians. They saw men broken by sorrow. They lowered their guard. The procession entered the cool, incense-heavy air of the cathedral. The bishop stood at the altar, robed in gold and silk, ready to receive the penitent's soul. The Vikings placed the coffin in the centre of the nave. The heavy wooden doors of the church were closed behind them, sealing the mourners inside with the city's entire religious and political elite. The bishop began the Latin chant, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The Vikings stood motionless, heads down. The air was thick with the scent of frankincense and the damp wool of the northerners. Then, a sound cut through the chanting, a sharp, distinct creak of wood prying against iron. The bishop paused. He looked at the coffin. The heavy lid shifted. A hand, gripping a sword, punched through the gap, sending splinters flying across the holy floor. Björn Ironside was not dead. With a roar that shook the stained glass, Björn kicked the lid of the coffin aside. He sprang up, fully armoured, his sword gleaming in the candlelight. This was the signal. The mourning Vikings cast aside their cloaks, revealing axes and blades hidden beneath. The sobs of grief turned instantly into the terrifying war cries of the north. The cathedral became an abattoir. The bishop didn't even have time to scream before he was cut down at the altar. The city leaders, trapped in the nave, were slaughtered where they stood. Björn rushed to the church doors and threw them open. The rest of the Viking army, waiting in the shadows of the city walls, surged in. The sack of Luna was absolute. The Vikings, furious at the weeks of delay, unleashed their frustration on the population. They stripped the marble temples of their silver ornaments. They tore the gold threads from the tapestries. They herded the citizens into the squares to be enslaved. Hastein walked through the carnage, stepping over bodies to reach the high altar. He grabbed a trembling priest by the collar, demanding to be taken to the treasures of St. Peter. He demanded to see the Pope. The priest, eyes wide with terror and confusion, shook his head. "The Pope?" he stammered in broken Latin. "The Pope is in Rome. This is Luna." Hastein stopped. The noise of the looting seemed to fade. He looked around at the white marble columns, the amphitheatre, the grand plazas. It was magnificent, yes, but it was not Rome. They were 200 miles north of their target. The realization hit Björn and Hastein with the force of a physical blow. They had sailed across the known world. They had sacrificed hundreds of men. They had defied empires, all for the wrong city. The Rome they had conquered was just a provincial quarry town compared to the Eternal City. The embarrassment was profound. If the other Viking jarls back in Kattegat ever found out, Björn would be the laughingstock of the north. Hastein, ever the pragmatist, made a quick decision. They would burn the city to the ground. They would leave no stone standing, no record of their mistake. They would take the gold, the slaves, and the glory of conquering a great marble city, and they would never ever correct anyone who called it Rome. But the map had run out. The fleet was heavy with loot, the men were exhausted, and the ships were rotting. They couldn't march to the real Rome. They didn't have the strength left. It was time to go home. But to go home, they had to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar again, and the Emir of Córdoba had not forgotten them. He had been waiting, building, and preparing a welcome gift that would turn the Mediterranean into a grave. The Viking fleet that departed the Italian coast was a floating treasury. Every inch of deck space was crammed with silver chalices, bundles of silk, and terrified slaves. The ships sat dangerously low in the water, their freeboard, the distance between the gunwale and the waves, reduced to mere inches. They had stripped Luna of everything valuable, but in doing so they had burdened themselves with a deadly handicap. A Viking longship is designed to dance over the waves. These ships were ploughing through them, sluggish and unresponsive, but there was a deeper, more insidious rot setting in, one that no amount of gold could fix. As they sailed west, back toward the setting sun, captains began to report strange leaks. Planks that had held firm against the North Sea storms were suddenly spongy and porous. The culprit was microscopic, silent, and devastating. The Mediterranean is home to Pterodo navalis, the naval shipworm. To the biology of the north, this creature was unknown. The Vikings built their ships from oak, which is durable, but in the warm saline waters of the south, the unprotected wood became a feast. Beneath the waterline, millions of these termites of the sea were honeycombing the hulls. The magnificent dragon ships were being eaten alive from the inside out. The journey became a slow-motion nightmare. One night, off the coast of Sardinia, a ship simply disintegrated. There was no storm, no enemy ram. The hull just gave way, the wood snapping like dry twigs. The ship, weighed down by tons of looted gold, sank like a stone. Björn watched helplessly as 40 of his men and a fortune in treasure vanished into the black water. There was no time to save them. The fleet could not stop. The psychological toll was immense. The men were rich beyond their wildest dreams, yet they were sailing in coffins. Every creak of timber sounded like a death knell. Björn Ironside walked the deck of his flagship, his boots stepping over piles of coinage that now seemed mocking. He had conquered the Rome of his imagination, but he was losing the war against nature, and ahead of them the real war waited. Scouts brought word that the Strait of Gibraltar was no longer an open door. The Emirate of Córdoba had learned from the sack of Seville. They knew the Vikings had to return the way they came. The Emir had deployed his new fleet, ships designed specifically to hunt Vikings, at the narrowest choke point of the Mediterranean. He had installed catapults on the cliffs. He had stockpiled naphtha. Björn Ironside faced the impossible choice. To fight, the ships needed to be light and agile. To be rich, the ships had to be heavy. He looked at the gold, the price of his immortality, the proof that he was greater than his father. Then he looked at the rotting hulls. Greed wrestled with survival. He refused to dump the treasure. He gambled that the reputation of the Northmen alone would be enough to scare the Moors. He gambled that the wind would favour them. It was the arrogance of a man who had never truly lost. As the pillars of Hercules rose on the horizon, grey and forbidding against the sky, the wind died. The sails went slack. The current of the strait turned against them, and from the shadow of the Rock of Gibraltar, the silhouette of the Andalusian fleet emerged. They were fresh, they were fast, and they were carrying fire. The Strait of Gibraltar is only 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. On a clear day, you can see the white houses of Africa from the cliffs of Europe. But for the Viking fleet, the strait had become a throat, and the jaws were closing. As Björn's flagship, the Ironside, drifted into the channel, the sea exploded. The Emir's fleet did not sail out to meet them in a line of battle. They swarmed. Smaller, agile galleys, powered by banks of rowers who knew every current and eddy of the strait, darted out from the jagged coastline. They flanked the heavy, gold-laden Viking longships like packs of wild dogs isolating a wounded herd. Björn roared orders, trying to bring his ship around to face the threat. But the tiller was sluggish. The hull, heavy with loot and riddled with shipworms, refused to respond. The legendary manoeuvrability of the Viking longship, the very advantage that had allowed them to terrorise Europe, was gone. They were sitting ducks. Then came the smell, a sharp chemical pungency that cut through the salt air. From the decks of the Andalusian ships, soldiers lit fuses on ceramic pots. They utilised a technology that had been refined in the laboratories of Baghdad and Córdoba, naphtha, a primitive form of napalm. They launched these pots with terrifying accuracy. When the pots smashed against the Viking decks, they didn't just break. They erupted. Liquid fire splashed across the wood, soaking into the sails, the ropes, and the beards of the warriors. Water did nothing to stop it. In fact, when the Vikings frantically threw buckets of seawater onto the flames, the fire only spread, floating on top of the water like a living, hungry carpet. The Strait of Gibraltar turned into a furnace. On the deck of the Ironside, chaos reigned. Men who had stood fearless against the Saxons and Franks were now screaming in high, thin voices as the fire melted the chainmail to their skin. Björn watched a neighbouring ship, the Serpent of the North, turn into a torch. He saw his warriors jumping into the sea only to find the water itself was burning. The heat was unbearable. The tar used to seal the hulls began to boil. The ship was dying. Björn realised with a sickening jolt that his greed was acting as an anchor. The tons of silver and gold in the hold were dragging them down, making them too slow to outrun the flames. He made the only choice left to him. He drew his sword, not to fight the enemy, but to cut the lashings of the cargo. He screamed at his huscarls, "Throw it out! All of it!" The men hesitated. This was the plunder of a 3-year odyssey. This was their retirement, their glory, their proof of manhood. Björn grabbed a chest of silver coins, wealth that could have bought a kingdom in Norway, and heaved it over the rail. "Live," he roared, "or die rich!" One by one, the chests went overboard. Chalices from Luna, silks from Seville, slaves from Africa, all jettisoned into the deep blue water of the strait. As the weight lifted, the ship groaned and rose in the water. The oarsmen, coughing in the smoke, found a new rhythm. The Ironside began to pick up speed, cutting a path through the burning wreckage of the rest of the fleet. They broke the blockade. Björn's ship and a handful of others punched through the smoke, emerging into the Atlantic. They didn't look back, they couldn't bear to watch. Behind them, the battle didn't taper off. It simply ceased to be a contest. Of the 62 ships that had left Scandinavia, only 20 survived the gauntlet. 40 ships, 2/3 of the expedition, were incinerated or sunk. Then the noise stopped. The screams faded as the men drowned. The roar of the fire died down as the timber was consumed. What was left was a silence so profound it felt physical. The sun set over the Atlantic, casting a blood-red light over the strait. The only sound was the hissing of charred wood cooling in the water and the gentle lap of waves against floating debris. There were no victory songs. The Emir's fleet turned back to Algeciras, their job done. They didn't need to chase the survivors. They had broken the myth. The sea was empty, save for the drifting ashes of the invincible Northmen. The journey home was a funeral march on water. Of the 62 proud dragon ships that had departed 3 years earlier, only 20 battered vessels limped back into the harbour of Kattegat in 862 AD. The sails were tattered, the hulls were scorched, and the men on the benches were gaunt, their eyes haunted by the horrors of the strait. They did not return as conquering heroes. They returned as survivors. The families waiting on the dock scanned the faces of the rowers, and the wailing began before the ropes were even tied. 2/3 of a generation had been wiped out. The cost of Björn Ironside's ambition was a mountain of ash floating in the Mediterranean. But history is often written by the survivors, and history has a strange sense of humour. Despite the catastrophe at Gibraltar, despite the jettisoning of treasure, the few chests that remained were still enough to shatter the economy of the North. In the poverty-stricken lands of Scandinavia, even the scraps of the Viking Mediterranean Raid were a fortune. Björn Ironside used this blood money to secure his power. He didn't speak of the fake Rome or the humiliating defeat by the Moors. He spoke of the blue men, the marble towers, and the fire that walked on water. He spun the disaster into a saga of endurance. He eventually became the King of Sweden, the founder of the Munster dynasty. He had stepped out of Ragnar Lothbrok's shadow, not by surpassing his father's victories, but by surviving a defeat that would have broken a lesser man. However, the world had changed. The Mediterranean expedition marked the high watermark of Viking expansion. It was the moment the heathen army hit the hard wall of advanced civilization. The Emirate of Córdoba and the fortifications of the south proved that the Vikings were not demons. They were flesh and blood, vulnerable to steel, fire and strategy. Europe learned. They built bridges to block rivers. They hired professional cavalries. They adopted the technologies that had saved Seville. The age of easy plunder was ending. The Vikings would continue to raid for another 2 centuries, but the aura of invincibility died there amidst the burning wreckage in the Strait of Gibraltar. Björn Ironside lived the rest of his days as a rich and powerful king. But one wonders, in the quiet of the night, when the fire crackled in the hearth, did he see the flames of the Andalusian naphtha? Did he hear the screams of the men he left behind? He sought immortality, and he found it. But the price was the end of the Viking myth. If you want to uncover more stories about how history's greatest figures really met their match, click that subscribe button. The past is filled with lessons that we are still learning today. Leave a comment below. Do you think Björn was a hero for surviving, or a villain for leading his men into a slaughter? I'll see you in the next video.